About the role of women in politics. Mandisa Mashego from the Economics Freedom Fighters from the African National Congress. With us is Anisa Mazimpaka, and in our Seapoint studio, Siviwe Gwarube of the Democratic Alliance, as Asanda, Ngoasheng, political analyst. Welcome to you all. Anisa, welcome. I know you've just joined in late on the discussion, but perhaps we can start off from your point of view, when we're talking about the role of women in politics. What do you think is the one thing that we still have not dealt with if we're to rewrite the history books of the role women should and are playing in our democratization in this country?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. So first and foremost, I think what's important is, as women, is for us to learn about the history that the woman played. The role of the woman, as we know, is very important. And what still needs to be done is the recognition that women need to come to the table. I think there hasn't been that acceptance by, we live in a patriarchal society, right? And I think we still have to come to that acceptance that the woman is going to come to the table and make decisions, and her decisions have to be taken as seriously as her male counterparts.
So you would say that as a society we still believe that the man occupies that authority in society and the woman is subservient?
That's where we're trying as women to move away from, because as it stands, it is like that. Women go to, for example, the negotiation table, and they're not taken as seriously as a male counterpart. If a male counterpart had to come and take the role of the woman, they'd be taken more seriously than the woman. And unfortunately, that's just a reality that we have to face in order to fight these inequalities that we see.
From your point of view, what informs that? And I know it's been then centuries of patriarchal society, but one would think that 25 years, when we aware of the role that women played in bringing us to the point where we're at, initiating a lot of those boycotts, those protests, even women in war have not been fairly reflected in our history books. So why are we still stuck in that? And I know the global order is contending with that, but South Africa specifically, what are your thoughts, Anisa?
It's a very difficult one, like you say. It's across the globe, right? I was at a program earlier on, and statistics show that in order for us to achieve women equality, female equality, it'll take us about 200 years, right? And that is a study that has been conducted. So I think it's a curse that that is upon us, just like how it was upon the generation 25 years ago. I think this is something that we still have to push, because as much as the generation before us fought, we still have to also play our role as a country.
So, you know, this is exactly the problem with having to accept. You know, it's a tragedy when somebody says that there's patriarchy and everybody must contend with it. Here's the reality. We are in politics. We are supposed to be lawmakers. We sit with various laws, many of them. Firstly, over 2,000 pieces of legislation that are apartheid laws that have never been challenged by the very same governing party that has presided over those laws. And many of those laws, if you go in deep into them, are essentially geared at subjugating women, and specifically the black woman. But here's the second thing. We have laws like the Termination of Pregnancy Act, and you have many other laws which are now post-apartheid laws, which the government itself refuses to ensure that those laws are actually implemented and applied in government. They allow all sorts of attitudes and negative behaviors by staff in the hospitals and clinics to actually reject women who need to come. Now, you are in a country that has the highest rape in the world. 3 women die every day at the hands of their partners. We've got the worst forms of sexual harassment. Private sector companies, and I always like to focus on the private sector, because the private sector is encouraged and spurred on by the fact that we have a government and parliaments that fail to apply laws. Private sector companies don't have sexual harassment policies, but they harass us as the EFF on a daily basis about whether or not we have a sexual harassment policy. And by the way, yes, we do have one. But the point I was coming to is that accepting the state of patriarchy itself is a problem. The education system is highly westernized in terms of its content and even how that content is delivered. We know that the indigenous African ways of teaching work for us in our communities. But we've allowed, because we accept things like racism, white supremacy, and we all know the relationship between racism and patriarchy, like I've just demonstrated to you earlier, that black women are the ones who suffer the most. 50% of workers earn less than 3,500 a month. And in that 50% bracket of all workers, majority are women. Why? Because black women can only get jobs as cleaners, as security guards, as receptionists, as call center agents, and all sorts of menial labor. And everybody accepts it. And it's okay for us to say, no, it will take us 200 years. There's no ways that I'm going to accept that my daughter and her children and her children and her children.
So, Mandisa, I want to talk about that acceptance, questions that we sometimes give Siviwe. I was reading a quote somebody sent in a WhatsApp group. So basically it was about Paul Kagame saying the problem with us as Africa is that we're always waiting for a seat at the table with a begging bowl, yet we've got the resources, so why are we asking for permission? So it seems to speak to a paucity of whether it's innovation or just even the strength to yank the chain and say the sheer demographic weight of women on the continent, the world over, is far greater. So what stops women? Siviwe?
Yeah, I mean, the question of acceptance is an interesting one, because I agree that, you know, we cannot simply just accept that it will take us, you know, another 200 years to undo the effects of what hundreds of years have done. But at the same time, we also have to be realistic about where we find ourselves. Because remember that the struggle for women in South Africa is almost two-pronged. It's not just about representation and, you know, how many women are in spaces of leadership, but also it becomes very basic and also very, very, it goes to the core of who people are. So you're looking at economic exclusion of women, but you're also looking at issues of safety for women. The fact that women in this country are almost living in a war zone because they are hunted down by intimate partners, by strangers. So it's a two-pronged fight that we need to have. One, we need to be able to hold organizations that we occupy to account when we are not seeing the requisite representation that we need. And like you said, we need to yank the chair and demand the space and create those spaces and then open the door for other women to come in. And so we need to take up almost that challenge. But at the same time, and not neglecting the fact that there are women out there, and including ourselves, who on a daily basis are leading families, they are unemployed, they are also living in deeply unsafe areas, and also the fact that they are basically the biggest victims of crime. And so accepting, no. But we also need to have those very difficult conversations about how then do we responsibly occupy spaces which we've been locked out before, and also how are we influencing policy in order to make sure that the woman who lives at Khayelitsha can understand that, one, she can be able to get a job, but at the same time she's not hunted
so
you know, in a gang-ridden area where she cannot essentially live a life of dignity. So those are the two-pronged, in my view, those are the two challenges that as women in leadership and as women in South Africa we need to
respond.
Okay.
I'd really like to respond.
Very quickly. I want to respond
very quickly. It's not true. I mean, what we're doing is we're falling for the trap of the dominance of both racism and men. You must remember, as a black woman, I'm not just subjected to patriarchy. I'm subjected to racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Those are two separate things that come together and form. There are things that can be done. It's not true that we must find a way of accepting a reality. What is the reality? I'll tell you, go to any university's graduation. Majority of the students who are graduating are black women. But they are in that grouping where their unemployment is at 60%. So what am I talking about? Racism and patriarchy put together. Women can't sit back anymore. There's no ways. I mean, you're going to march until when? Women have to put up a fight. They have to put up a decisive fight. And one of the things that help in a struggle is cohesion. Women have to find a place and a time when they can agree. What are the basic minimum demands economically? First, we want land. then we demand industrialization. Then we demand a free, quality, decolonized education. But within that decolonization, there must be gender studies that are African feminist based. There are studies that can actually be designed to empower the black child, that specifically talk to Afrofeminism, because you must separate from Western feminism and African. A white woman's feminist struggle is not the same as my and your feminist struggle and the feminist struggle of a black child who is in a township or who is in an informal settlement or in a rural area. We must start pushing the boundaries. This warm and fuzzy talk of let's hold hands and sing kumbaya, it can't work. It works for the elite
Mandisa,
and for the comfortable,
which is
not
why
for the poor.
I wanted to bring this question
of
to
the
the fore.
infrastructure.
And I'll come to you, Asanda, about that. Because 25 years later, one of the biggest expenditure for government has been infrastructure development. And I'm asking, has that been done through a gender lens? So if we're talking about rural women, we're talking about land ownership, and we're saying we're trying to improve their lot, have roads been built to allow them to be able to be entrepreneurial, to be able to be successful in some of those ventures, and that's just a drop in the ocean of some of the challenges that confront women.
No, I mean, I don't think that urban planning has taken the struggles of women into consideration at all, because if you look at South African public transport, it actually ends quite early. If you go anywhere else in the world, you can find public transport quite late into the night. And in South Africa, our public transport ends quite early, which means that women are then left to use either taxi hailing services if they can afford them, or women are generally having to rely on men, who are the majority of people with cars, to be able to take them home. And that's where some of the abuse of women, and particularly young girls, take place, because they're coming back from a party and they've had to rely on this boyfriend, or they had to rely on this male friend or whoever else to take them home. So we are not building our cities in ways that are, considering the very specific requirements of women, like safety. We are not building our homes in ways that consider the very specific needs of women. We are not, if you look at informal settlements in the Western Cape, for example, and the way that the toilets, for example, are structured, women have to walk outside at night to go and use the toilet. Women on their periods are facing impossible situations every single month. And, the government, both at a local and at a national level, hasn't actually done much to end this, for example. So I think we haven't really done enough. And for me, what I would really be interested in is we're sitting with female politicians and we're having a very hypothetical discussion and debate about what we should and shouldn't be doing. Personally, I'd really like to know from them, as people who are in the hot seat and people who are actually policy making, what are they doing in their very powerful political parties? Because, the ANC is the governing party at national government. What is your political party doing? The Democratic Alliance is governing us in the Western Cape. What is that political party doing? And what are you as women within these political parties, including the economic freedom fighters, because they sit in parliament and they sit in all these decision-making bodies. What are you guys doing as female politicians to ensure that the women's voices are represented, to ensure that these things that we're talking about at a very hypothetical level are changing?
Asanda, thank you very much for that question. It is something that I was going to pose to all of you, but fair enough, though. I know I've had discussions with each and every one of you about this very aspect. What are you doing? What the challenges are? But let me start with you, Anisa. If we're looking at the cost to GDP annually of gender-based violence or femicide, wouldn't that money be better spent on creating infrastructure that will keep women safe? We're talking today on Women's Day that we're deploying more women officers out there in the street. This is but a day in a year in order to say we're celebrating Women's Month.
Okay, so before I go on, I just want to clarify something. I wasn't talking about accepting issues of patriarchy and how long it would take. It was me saying that we have to acknowledge that this is how long it'll take, so that our fight could be strong, it could be harder. But to get back to your question, yes, I do agree the money that's being spent could be better channeled, right? Us having a more proactive as opposed to a more reactive approach. So what the ANC Youth League, what the ANC Women's League is doing is calling for example, your police stations, because we have to look at the nitty-gritties in order to actually deal with the issues that amount to national crises. You have to look at it from a grassroots level. And one of the issues that we've identified is, for example, gender-based violence, like you speak about. When women go to report these issues at police stations, you find that the police officers they don't know how to handle these things, which then perpetuates this issue of gender-based violence, because it requires the woman to go back to that unsafe environment. But yes, these are stuff that...
Let me jump in here, and either of you can disagree or agree with me.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, I think if you look at transitional governments in Africa, the world over, it has been a much known fact that it often descends to violence, and a lot of that violence afflicts women. So if we're saying 25 years, we're still talking about, oh, we need to train our men better, or the officers. Why are we still at those beginning stages?
Look, Tsapi, so here's the big problem, and I mentioned it earlier. I'm not sure what people want the EFF to do. We're an opposition party. What we can do is bring forward our policies, and we've done that. It would take me at least an hour to take you through all the propositions that the EFF has in terms of what must happen with women from a legislation point of view, and also from a restructuring government. We have stated very clearly that no less than 50% of government procurement must go to women, and particularly the youth, 30% of that, and black people in particular. We've also enforced, we've also want to enforce, if we were governing and if we could actually implement a law like that, we would make sure that the private sector is the beginning. Government spent 3 trillion rand on infrastructure. And infrastructure is not just roads, by the way. Infrastructure is roads, it's bridges, even telecommunications is infrastructure. They spent 3 trillion rand between 1998 and 2017 on infrastructure. They can't give you now, the ANC must tell us now, because they've been governing for that period, right? How much of that 3 trillion rand actually reached Uspogazi, Nosonto, in the townships where they come from? I'm not talking about EPWP. So here are the things that we want to propose, and we have repeatedly proposed. The labor broking system needs to be abolished, which means the law within the Labor Relations Act, the aspect within the Labor Relations Act that permits labor broking, needs to be abolished. Not just to say when somebody is employed for 3 months as a temp or more than 3 months, it must be taken on permanently. We must abolish it, which means it must be illegal, because it's a crime against humanity. The tender system, the state tender system, here in Gauteng, we are sitting with massive amounts of corruption of the state tender system. What is being wasted? It's your and my money. That money can go a long way in enforcing the very laws, in the affirmative action laws, in the labor relations laws, laws such as the Termination of Pregnancy Act that I was talking about earlier, and many, many other laws. By the way, the ANC is just using this thing as a scapegoat that things don't happen at police stations. The police already have gender-affirming policies. Go to their website now. You will find under the SAPS a whole lot of beautiful things that are supposed to happen when you go to a police station. The issue is enforcement, and the issue is getting accountability right at the top.
And we don't have the thing that I wanted to raise, Mandisa, because for me, if we talk about sexual and reproductive health rights, for instance, you do not need to plow money into that. Some of these things are attitudinal challenges by hospital staff, by even healthcare givers, or even just access to facilities that will allow women to make their own choices. So why are we stuck on issues where we're focusing on the money that is required or the training that needs to be done, but if the policies are there, why is there no implementation? And this is not just to the ANC, but I think because I'll come to the Democratic Alliance as well, because you're in governance in the Western Cape. And so
okay, so for me, right, personally as a youth, right, I feel that when these policies are tabled, right, like Mandisa is saying, we have these beautiful policies. It's all about implementation. And I think that's where the problem is. Because as much as we can talk about policy, we need that implementation part. And then the problem comes...
What's hindering it from where you sit, from your experience?
As a youth, right? Look, you have politicians and decision-making bodies, and somewhere along the line, something somewhere gets stuck. And obviously, it's the people on the ground that get affected. So ours, as the youth, as part of these youth formations in these political spaces, is to keep pushing for accountability, and not just from one party as the ANC, because it's not just the ANC that's governing this country alone.
It must take responsibility.
ANC has majority, but you must remember that there's the EFF, there's the DA, and
no,
there's
we are
other
not
parties.
part of your government.
No, it's not part of the government.
We ask
but
questions your people don't account. No, but you can't say that.
But allow her to finish her training.
You have to take, and this is where accountability comes into play. You cannot have parties that form part of a government or that form part of a national structure and that hold seats in parliament say that they're not going to account simply because the ANC holds a majority.
We don't have a minister, we don't have an MEC, we don't have an MMC, we are not
You have members of party.
No, we are opposition, Mami.
Yes, you have,
the difference
but you have a mandate. You have a mandate from your people who put you in parliament to be accountable, and this is the accountability that we're running away from. I do understand what multi-party democracy is. Okay, but so you're telling me that
coalition with ANC.
You're telling me that you don't account to your people,
okay, so
because mine is for the EFF.
No, you must account for government as the ANC. Which part of that don't you understand?
The ANC does have accountable in the Western Cape, and what do you do? Where do you get stuck, as Anisa was saying, that somewhere somewhere goes wrong?
Yeah, I think perhaps the conversation that we've been having for the last minute or two is actually one of the places where we get stuck. Somebody mentioned in the discussion that it's quite important. I mean, if you look back to the struggle of women back in 1956, those women across racial lines, across really from all corners of society, were able to come together so that they can defeat a common cause. The reality is that here's a wild thought that I don't think as South African women we do enough to reach across the aisle to say these are the common things that we share. The idea of safety for women, the idea that, a department for women,
so
children,
practically
people
as a
with
democratic alliance,
is just simply that. A department.
As a democratic
it's not really
alliance,
going to change materially the lives of people. So these are the things that we can all agree on. How then do we, across political lines, across racial lines, move in and start changing those things? And so sometimes I think that we can work a little bit in silos and talk about, you're in the ANC and therefore you're in government. I can understand that.
Is there an example that the Democratic Alliance has made that effort, reached across the line, the aisle, and has been turned down on a critical issue by any one of these parties?
No, there isn't a practical example to say we've been turned down, but I'm saying this is part of the problem. So the idea, for instance, around Tutuzela centers and sensitivities around SAPs and all of and that's where people go and report rape cases. The fact that there are people, the women who still go to SAPs and are basically re-victimized is something that we can all rally around and we can't disagree on. So no, we haven't been able to work together enough as political parties and as women in political parties. And that I form part of that, and I form part of that problem, because I'm able to see that part of the reasons why we are not able to pick up that fight harder is to say that we're not going to be divided by political lines, but there are certain things that women that are completely non-negotiable, that as women in politics that we should be championing.
All right.
And so it's something that we must all take away from this discussion, that we need to do better at really representing women who don't really care what T-shirt you wear.
All right.
At women whose lives are in danger every day, who live in communities, who don't really care who you are or what party you represent. But they expect us to do better, and they expect us to show up for them a lot more.
It's such a pity. I really had hoped we'd have more time, but I really want to thank each and every single one of you for your contribution. I think there's a lot to pick up from, and hopefully at some point we will do that and be able to reach some modicum of agreement on the way forward. But thank you very much to the economic freedom fighters, Mandisa, Mashego from the African National Congress, is Anisa, Mazimpaka, and Siviwe Gwarube of the Democratic Alliance in our Seapoint studios, as well as Asanda, Ngoasheng, political analyst. That has been our discussion on women in politics. But now let's take you back live to Durban for the 20